Hello, everyone, and welcome. Tonight's event, hosted by the American Zionist Movement, the World Zionist Organization Herzl Center, the Herzl Collection, and the Canadian Zionist Federation. We welcome you to this very special gathering, virtual, of course, where we are going to honor Theodor Herzl, a charismatic leader, here on Herzl Day. Theodor Herzl is celebrated every year in Israel with a specific holiday on the 10th of Iyar, and it's known as Yom Herzl. It was recognized by the Knesset a number of years ago. The American Zionist movement is comprised of 33 national Jewish Zionist organizations and works across a broad ideological, political, and religious spectrum, linking the American Jewish community together in support of Israel, Zionism, and the Jewish people. As we come together tonight to honor Yom Herzl, we think about his role in bringing together Zionists of all different places in the world, all different ideologies and approaches and philosophies, and we honor his legacy as a leader tonight as we welcome Professor Derek Penslar from Harvard University. To open up this evening, I would first like to welcome Mrs. Tova Dorfman, Chair of the Herzl Center in Jerusalem, who's going to give us some remarks on this very special occasion. Tova?
Thank you. Thank you, Elana. I'm glad to join you from Jerusalem. And we actually kicked off our Yom Herzl today with a very special film in Herzl's study at the Herzl Museum with Bougie Herzog, who is the chair of the Jewish Agency for Israel, and Yaakov Chagoel, who is the chair of the World Zionist Organization. They're putting together an educational clip about Herzl and his works. And from that point on, we went to the Knesset, which today formally, usually it's tomorrow, but because Knesset is not in session tomorrow, we celebrated Herzl Day today at the Knesset, where every faction spoke about Herzl and the significance of his activities and his accomplishments obviously for the creation of the state of Israel, for Zionism. It was quite interesting because it was the array of the various political parties that spoke today. So it was a fascinating special session we had at Knesset. And tomorrow the activities continue with a huge educational program where we have about 50,000 school children. Our kids are back at school full time. And we have in 25 cities, 50,000 kids are participating in an interactive program online about Herzl. And followed by, we now have about 12 busloads of people coming from all over the country, from the periphery, from the central part of the country to Jerusalem, to spend the afternoon at the Herzl Center, at the museum, at Har Herzl, to celebrate Herzl's birthday, basically. So it's very exciting, and we are thrilled that we are able finally to open our doors to people and to have people come and visit us and to celebrate Herzl's life. And I'm excited to listen to Professor Penslar and his great works that he's done on Theodor Herzl. So thank you for having me, and we are really pleased to be co-sponsoring this event.
Thank you so much, Tova. It's wonderful to see that Herzl's legacy continues to be celebrated both in social, cultural, and also political arenas. Again, we're here to welcome Professor Derek Penslar, who is the William Lee Post Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University and the Samuel Zaks Professor of Jewish History Emeritus at the University of Toronto. Between 2012 and 2016, Professor Penslar served as the inaugural holder of the Stanley Lewis Chair in Israel Studies, a very big accomplishment for many universities who sometimes struggle with their Israel Studies departments. And he was at the University of Oxford. He is the author of many books on Israel, and his most recent book is a story of Herzl, the Charismatic Leader. And it's interesting how we get to look at a new picture of Herzl, whose name has been known known for many generations, but we're constantly, as Zionism changes today, as the social and political spectrums change today, then we are in need of some inspiration from these leaders of our past. So I welcome you, Professor Penslar, and very excited to also welcome the questions of any of our participants from throughout the country and around the world even, that you may please add your questions and we will get to them at the end of Professor Penslar's presentation. So please don't hesitate to share your thoughts. Professor Penslar, welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Thank you, Dr. Heideman. Thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you from all over the world who have joined in. It's a great honor to be able to speak with you about Theodor Herzl on Yom Herzl. And what I'm going to do for the next half an hour or so is talk a bit about the topic, what makes a great Jewish leader, because I think the best way to appreciate Herzl's greatness is to appreciate him within a Jewish context, but also within a context of global leadership. He was very much a product of his time, and he was a great national leader. In some ways can be compared to others of his generation. But the first question I want to ask is, who is a Jewish leader, and what does it mean to be a Jewish leader? And the fact is, until the 20th century, leaders in Jewish civilization, once we get past the period of biblical antiquity, the leaders of Jewish civilization were religious figures. So when you think about it, after all, the first great Jewish figure, even in the Bible, is not a king, not a warrior, but a prophet. Moses. And in the long centuries and millennia after the end of the biblical kingdoms, the Jews' leaders tended to be rabbis, spiritual leaders. So here we have a representation of the Rambam of Maimonides. We don't know what Maimonides actually looked like, but it's a famous representation of him. And all the way up into the 18th century, one of the great rabbinical figures, philosophers, literary figures of Jewish modernity, Moses Mendelssohn. So time after time, when we think about what it means to be a great Jewish leader throughout thousands of years of Jewish history, we think about people who are not political leaders per se. They might be leaders of their communities. They might negotiate with kings and with lords and with other forms of secular authority, but they're not political leaders in the conventional sense of the word. Even into the 20th century, many of the Jews' greatest leaders were people who attained status in the world as a whole, either through success in finance and banking or in business. Here we see on the left Moses Montefiore, perhaps the most significant Jewish philanthropist in the 19th century. And then we see on the right, Louis Marshall, founder of leader of the American Jewish Committee, and an important figure also in the founding of the Jewish Agency, the Sochnut. Although he himself would not identify formally with Zionism, he was extremely important in the promotion of the Jewish national home before his tragic death in 1929. So to be a Jewish leader really meant all sorts of things other than what we would think of as, for example, a leader in the United States might be a politician, a senator, or that sort of thing. Now, there were Jewish leaders in modern history who were people in politics. They were members of parliament of various countries. They were even ministers. Here we have Adolphe Crémieux, who was the justice minister in France in the mid-19th century, and a man with great commitments to Jewish communities throughout the world. And he was partly responsible for the decree that granted the Jews of Algeria citizenship in 1870. So you do have Jewish leaders who are themselves political figures, but they're primarily political leaders for the country in which they live. They're members of the French parliament or of the German parliament or even of the Russian parliament before 1917. There were Jewish members of the parliament. But this is then what makes Herzl unique, is that the Jews, after all, in the early 20th century, did not have a state. They did not have a political entity of any kind. And Herzl arose and he basically created something. And how was he able to do it? This gets us to the second thing I want to talk about, which is what it means to be charismatic. And my book is called The Charismatic Leader, and that's the theme that runs through the book, that in Jewish history, including ancient biblical history, there have been times where the people are in a state of crisis. And when they are in a state of crisis, they need a new kind of leadership. And the sociologist Max Weber famously wrote in the early 20th century that in ancient Israel, the shoftim, the judges, were charismatics, people who arose in a time of great stress. They had a state of charis in Greek, or chen in Hebrew, a kind of divine grace. They led the people, and then their job was done and they moved on, or they were killed. The charismatic then is someone who arises in a time of great danger for any people. In more modern times, Weber wrote, politicians are charismatic leaders. They're able to appeal to the masses. They're able to draw people into political activity. So for Weber and for his disciples, political leadership is really inseparable. Great political leadership is often inseparable from charisma. And Herzl himself was such a figure. The charismatic leader in modern history is someone who leads a country in a time of trial. So here we have Abraham Lincoln, who was leader during the American Civil War, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who took the United States through the Depression. This figure on the upper left, Benjamin Disraeli, perhaps not leading the United Kingdom through quite as stressful a time, but with a powerful personality and a man who left a great mark on British society. Herzl himself came onto the Jewish scene at a time when the Jewish world was in tatters. The physical and economic security of Jews in Eastern Europe was at an ebb, and Jews were increasingly no longer finding comfort or belief in rabbinic authority, and Herzl arose. And the question is, how was he able to do it? Well, he was able to do it because of obviously his intelligence and his dedication, but also because of his charisma. And like other great leaders of the 19th and 20th centuries, Herzl was able to fashion or create a charismatic persona. Just to give an example from other great charismatic leaders, Abraham Lincoln knew how tall he was, and he knew that the effect that his height had on people, and actually the stovepipe hat that he wore was deliberate to make him look even taller. Benjamin Disraeli was also a charismatic who dressed in a rather elaborate style and talked in a rather elaborate style, and he appealed to the British upper classes precisely because he was a bit outlandish, and that was something that people actually found enjoyable. The fact that he was a convert to Christianity meant little to them. They saw him as of Jewish origin, but in his case, it wasn't really an anti-Semitic response, quite often as a philo-Semitic one, that there was something exotic about him. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man who suffered his whole life from chronic pain because of polio and could not walk, cultivated an air of insouciance with his smile, with his cigarette holder, with his head thrown back, and his constant smile. Herzl did very much the same thing, that he was a man who knew that he was handsome, he knew that he was charismatic, and he knew how to appeal to an audience. And here we see Herzl at various stages of his life. I mean, he's a young man raised in Budapest, a man raised in comfort, a good-looking young man, but certainly nothing, at least on the outside, out of the ordinary. And again, we see him now as a teenager, more of the same. And then we see Herzl becoming a young adult. This is Herzl probably in his mid to late 20s before he grows the beard. So this is Herzl with mutton chops. And then the question is, well, when did Herzl grow his beard, which is one of his most famous characteristics? It was a deliberate act. Herzl was living in Paris in the early 1890s. He was the Paris correspondent for the most influential newspaper in Central Europe called the New Free Press, or the Neue Freie Presse. And he grew the beard at that time. And here we see it's probably about 1893, and you'd see that the beard is rather ordinary. It hasn't yet become the full, dark, rich beard that it will become later. And we're not quite sure exactly why he grew the beard. It may have been simply that he wanted to look older and more distinguished. Lots of men had facial hair at the time. It may be that it was part of his gradual process of Jewish discovery and self-discovery. That's possible. We're not entirely sure. But the beard became certainly a characteristic marker of him. The fact is that the desire to cultivate a self is actually a quality of leadership. I wanted to refer briefly also to some other great leaders who cultivated a way of dressing and looking. Mahatma Gandhi only adopted his loincloth and simple dress some decades after becoming an Indian nationalist leader. It became part of his brand, as it were. And his adversary, the founder of modern Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, always wore immaculate suits because that was an image he wanted to project. Martin Luther King Jr., the great Black American leader, always dressed impeccably, and that was part of, again, a persona that he wanted to project to the people. This is not trivial. This is not trivial. This is about appealing to the masses. And especially for Herzl, who we see again the change over time, the beard gets longer, but also as he aged, he had a number of medical issues I'll talk about later. But as he aged, he both unconsciously and consciously assumed an ever more charismatic appearance. So here we see him looking very much like the man about town. This is in the mid-1890s, a very handsome man. But here we see Herzl really in the fullness of his years as a Zionist leader, with his full beard and with his piercing eyes. People who met Herzl were overwhelmed by him. When they met him as an adult, when Herzl addressed the first Zionist Congress, people applauded for 15 minutes. Women fainted. Men kissed his hand. They wrote about the event afterwards. They wrote about the beauty of his face, his carriage. They wrote about his height. Herzl was about 5'7½", which at that time was actually considered fairly tall, about 2.5, 3 inches taller than average. So he wasn't a giant. It's like I'm 6'2", so I'm about 4 inches taller than average. Herzl was a little less than that in the standards of his time. So he was not huge, but he was tall enough, but he projected greatness. But the thing that people noticed most about him, aside from the beard, were his eyes. Dark, troubled eyes that seemed to incorporate or take into himself the suffering of the Jewish people. And this was something that was deeply attractive to individuals. There are a couple of different kinds of charismatic leaders. There are those who stand kind of aloof from afar, and people look up to them and venerate them. And then there are charismatic leaders who exude energy and make you feel great about yourself. I think that Herzl was more the first kind, that although Herzl did interact with people and he could be quite friendly and quite witty, I think the image of Herzl that really communicated to people was that of a figure alone, a prophet-like figure, somewhat sorrowful, and a figure who could inspire greatness in individuals, as opposed to an individual who you feel like you're the most important person in the room. So Herzl's charisma was something that was cultivated, as many great leaders do, and it was also sincere, because Herzl, after all, had sincere ambitions to be a great leader and to be of service to the Jewish people. Here again, we see an example of Herzl not just orchestrating his own charisma, but trying to inject, as it were, glamour, to use a 21st century term, or charisma, into the Zionist movement as a whole. The opening session of the first Zionist Congress, here we see Herzl, and the men all about him noted that it is men. There were women at the first Zionist Congress. There were about 13 women among the 200 plus people in attendance, but it was mostly men. You'll note that they're wearing evening dress. This was a requirement that Herzl put in place for the Sunday morning August event, that they would wear formal dress. I have read in some books that this was uncomfortably hot because it was August. I actually looked up the weather forecast in Basel for that Sunday morning. It was about 14 degrees Celsius that morning. By the time they got started, it was probably about 20 degrees Celsius. So 21 degrees, so about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So actually quite nice. If people weren't comfortable, it's because they weren't used to wearing the evening dress. These are a bunch of Jewish delegates, mainly from Eastern Europe. But it was an impressive gathering. So Herzl was trying to create an image of dignity and glamour, not only for himself, but for the movement as a whole. And of course, it was successful. So what happens is Herzl's own charisma, which is part of his own being and which he imparts onto the Zionist movement, is part of the story then of his greatness, but it's not all. If a person is charismatic, that in and of itself will not make them a great leader. You can be very good looking and have no charisma. You can have charisma and be utterly incompetent. And the world is full of charismatic charlatans. The world is full of charismatic thieves. The world is full of charismatics who are lazy and can't get any work done. Herzl's other quality was that he had an indefatigable work ethic. He worked 18 hours a day. He drove himself to an early death, I think, through working so hard. And he was able to corral a group of not necessarily cooperative individuals into forming a variety of organizations that laid the framework for the establishment of the State of Israel, the Zionist Congress, the what his ally Max Nordau called the Parliament of the Jewish People, which met every year until his death. He founded then the Zionist Organization, 1897, which changed its name in 1960 to the World Zionist Organization. He founded the first Zionist bank, the Jewish Colonial Trust, just a year later. Frankly, the bank didn't do so well, had a hard time getting started, but it eventually in time would become Bank Leumi. And Herzl was by no means the only one, but he was part of a team of people who came up with the idea of establishing a fund to purchase land in Eretz Israel, the Jewish National Fund. And he presided over all of these bodies with indefatigable effort and with no small amount of iron will, dealing again with many different factions. He had to deal with Orthodox Jewish Zionists who were insistent on the maintenance of halakha within the Zionist movement and within whatever would become in Eretz Israel. He had to deal with socialist Zionists. He had to deal with secular Zionists who were interested in reviving modern Hebrew for reasons that had nothing to do with religiosity. So while he was, as it were, the president of a Jewish parliament, which is really what the Zionist Congress turned into, there was an Orthodox faction, there was what was called the Democratic faction, and Herzl writes in his diary, these people are like eggs. He says, I'm balancing eggs. I've got the egg of the Orthodox, I've got the egg of the socialist, I've got the egg of the Jewish plutocrats, I've got the egg, and I'm throwing all the eggs up in the air. So again, charisma only gets us so far. It was also his organizational vision and his organizational ability. Now, going back in time a little bit, the question is how Herzl got to this place at all. How did he even become a Zionist? The story that we're told over and over again is that he was basically a happy, young man from an assimilated family who goes to Paris and then learns about anti-Semitism. We usually are told that the arrest of Captain Alfred Dreyfus traumatized him and that led him to Zionism, but I don't think this is true. Herzl, who left behind voluminous private writings, thousands of letters, as well as a quite detailed diary, Herzl doesn't even mention Dreyfus until late 1896. He became a Zionist in 1895. The Hebrew translation of Herzl's writings has a journalistic piece that Herzl wrote about the ceremony in which Dreyfus's sword was broken and he was officially degraded, as it were, cashiered from the French military. And the Hebrew writing has the crowd shouting, Mavet liYehudim, death to the Jews. I went and checked every Parisian newspaper on this event. They're shouting mort aux Judas or mort aux Juifs. I have not found a single eyewitness who said that they were saying mort aux Juifs, that they were saying mort aux Judas, or mort au traître, death to the traitor. And I also checked the originals, obviously, of Herzl's own journalistic writings. Herzl himself only wrote that he became a Zionist because of the Dreyfus trial in 1899. Before that, there's no reason, like from the time, to believe that this is what made him into a Zionist. We have actually a different timeline that makes more sense. Herzl got very worried about anti-Semitism as early as 1891, 1892. He wrote a play about Jews and anti-Semitism in 1894. The play was finished 3 weeks before Dreyfus's arrest was made public. I think Herzl was well on the way to thinking about solutions to the problem of anti-Semitism. And he was particularly obsessed by this man, Karl Lueger, who I know looks a bit like Seth Rogen, but don't be fooled. He was a canny politician who became the mayor of Vienna. Although he only became mayor in 1897, he was first elected some years previously. The emperor refused to recognize his election for a while. He was an out-and-out anti-Semite, and Vienna became a cauldron of anti-Semitic politics. And the more likely factor that turned Herzl to anti-Semitism was his panic about what was happening in his beloved Vienna, city he had moved to in his teens, where he went to university. And after all, where the newspaper he edited was headquartered, and he was moving back to Vienna from Paris in 1895. It's very interesting that just on the eve of his move back to Vienna in 1895, to go back to this man as the anti-Semitic mayor-elect, Herzl goes into a state of frenzy for several months and writes what will become the first draft of his pamphlet, The Jewish State. I do not think it's a coincidence. I think this has very little to do with Paris. It has very little to do with Dreyfus. It has much more to do with Vienna. So Herzl becomes a Zionist, and he reaches out to the masses. He doesn't just form these organizations, he is able to reach his public. Now, this is something that all great leaders are able to do. They're able to make a connection with the public, even if they are not necessarily warm and able to, slap people on the back and glad hand people. They have to inspire. And this is true of all the great political leaders of stateless nations or of young nations in Herzl's era. Charles Parnell, the founder of modern Irish nationalism, sort of like Herzl, by the way. He died young, he was very handsome. He was not exactly of his people. He was a Protestant. He wasn't a Catholic, but he found his way to his people. So that's a little bit like Herzl, who's assimilated, but finds his way to his people. Edvard Beneš and Jan Masaryk, founders of modern Czechoslovakia, were both intensely popular and attractive leaders. And even Józef Pilsudski, who himself was a man of the military, a Polish leader in the 1920s and 30s, all of these people were able to reach the masses. And that's what Herzl was able to do. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy because Herzl had rivals. There were among Eastern European Jews in the early 20th century, powerful and influential Zionist figures who frankly were jealous of Herzl. They felt that he was Jewishly an ignoramus. They felt that many of his schemes that I'll talk about in a moment to engage in diplomatic negotiations with great powers to create a Jewish state were dangerously audacious and might bring down the wrath of the Ottoman or the Russian governments upon the Jews. This man here was extremely hostile to Herzl. Menachem Ussishkin, who was based in Odessa. He later became president of the Jewish National Fund, in his own way a good-looking man with his own charismatic charm, and he and Herzl were at loggerheads much of the time. Here we see the famous Ahad Ha'am, the pen name for Asher Ginsburg. Ahad Ha'am, a brilliant man, an essayist, a critic who could see everything wrong with Herzl, but was incapable himself of leading a movement. The German Jewish humorist Sammy Groneman wrote about Ahad Ha'am that if he were in the presence of Achilles, he would only see his heel. So, but Ahad Ha'am was quite dismissive of Herzl. And then Natan Birnbaum, who was very much a Herzl manqué. This was a Viennese Jew who wanted very much to be a senior Zionist leader, worked in Herzl's shadow, and finally left in a huff. He eventually became a founder of the Agudas Yisrael. He became an ultra-Orthodox Jew and an anti-Zionist. So Herzl had a difficult time with these people, and yet he was able to reach beyond them. It was Herzl and not Ussishkin or Ahad Ha'am or Birnbaum who attracted the people. It was Herzl who was the subject of images like this. The famous photograph of Herzl overlooking the Rhine from his room at the Three Kings Hotel, photographed by E.M. Lillian. These photographs were disseminated throughout the world and attracted a mass following. Lillian also created these designs, these drawings of Herzl as various biblical figures, most famously as Moses. Here we see him displaying and breaking the 10 Commandments. I mean, this was a level of adoration that no other Zionist leader of the time was able to command. Again, images of Herzl, this is from during Herzl's own lifetime, as a larger than life figure. Again, these kinds of photographs that are distributed that have an impact that no other Zionist leader could have. And yet underneath that charisma, underneath that organizational ability was a deeply fragile man. Herzl was not a well man. He was rejected by the military. He had 2 military physicals when he was in his late teens, and he failed them both. We don't know why. The examination records don't say, but it appears that he had a heart murmur. He was diagnosed with a heart ailment at the age of 35. And I think retrospectively, we can assume that it was congenital. My son's a cardiologist, and he and I have talked about this, and we've read the medical reports. He may also have contracted lupus in his 30s or displayed it. We're not sure. I think the best bet is that he had a congenital heart defect, which was then aggravated by overwork. But he wasn't a well man, and he worked himself to an early grave. And this is not unusual, by the way, for great leaders. I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died not as young, but he had uncontrolled high blood pressure. It was related to his polio. And John F. Kennedy, the most charismatic of our American politicians in the 20th century was a man who suffered from many, many illnesses, including a very serious kidney disorder. Herzl himself suffered from more than physical illness. Herzl was not a happy man. He was troubled. Herzl openly wrote about his depression. He didn't hide it. He wrote about it in his diaries, which he actually intended for publication after his death. He was a man with longings for success that he felt he never quite achieved. Although he was not a bad playwright, he knew that he wasn't great, and his plays, they were performed, but he knew he could never reach the real heights of greatness. He was an outstanding journalist. I mean, just a wonderful journalist, but he didn't really respect his journalism. He wanted to be a great literary artist, and he wasn't. That wasn't his greatness. And he had a depressive personality. I think one reason Zionism meant so much to him is because he was good at it, and it gave him a sense of mission. He was also very unhappily married. I mean, his marriage was nothing but a disaster, I'm sorry to say. Julie Naschauer, his wife, she was much younger than him. She had issues of her own. Unfortunately, we don't have her letters to him. We only have his letters to her, which are pretty nasty. Her letters were entrusted to her youngest daughter, who died in Theresienstadt, and the letters were destroyed or lost. But he had an unhappy marriage, terribly unhappy. He contemplated divorce within a few months after his marriage. The letters are heartbreaking. He also, unfortunately, the tragic depression that affected Herzl, and again, Herzl's wife was also an unhappy woman, affected all three of his children. His daughter, Paulina, who became a drug addict and died young. His son, Hans, who had a very difficult life. He converted to different religions. He felt he lived in his father's shadow. He actually committed suicide on the day of Pauline's funeral. And then there was Trudy, the youngest, Margareta, who had mental issues, spent much of her life in institutions. She did marry and have a child, but she died in Theresienstadt. And then her son, who was in the British military and was seconded to, I think, the British Trade Mission in Washington, D.C. after World War II, he committed suicide when he learned of his parents' death. So it's a very tragic family. And there was something very deeply sad about Herzl, but that's not unusual. It's not unusual for great leaders. And here we see him prematurely aged. I mean, he was only 43 in this picture, but he looks, he looks older. He was very much a man alone. He didn't have friends, and that's not unusual for great leaders. Great leaders can't really trust people. They don't relate well to people. He had allies. David Wolfson was his most faithful lieutenant, who became the president of the ZO after Herzl's death. And they were on familiar terms. They used the du form in German with each other, but Herzl never really respected David Wolfson. He treated him sort of like a, like a butler. Herzl was also on good terms with Leon Kellner. They respected each other. This was a brilliant philologist from Czernowitz who knew everybody in England. And so Herzl used him to get connections in England, and they liked each other, but they weren't friends. Max Nordau, Herzl's closest ally, they never stopped using the Z form, the formal you with each other. They had a professional relationship, a very close professional relationship. They never confided in each other. So Herzl was very much a man alone, and this is not unusual. One of the greatest leaders of the 20th century was Winston Churchill. And Churchill suffered from depression. As we see in this famous essay by Anthony Storr, Winston Churchill's Black Dog. And there are things that Churchill wrote about himself that could easily have come from Herzl's own hand. When Winston Churchill wrote, "All men are worms, but I am a glowworm," that is something that Herzl himself could have written. So even Herzl's psychological issues or his family issues are actually typical of great leaders. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of Herzl was not building up the Zionist organization. It was his bold, some would say foolhardy attempts to negotiate with world leaders in order to get international recognition or a charter for mass Jewish settlement in Eretz Israel. Some people see him a great statesman, and his critics say that he was a lackey running from one great power to the next, basically saying that he would do their bidding. He certainly did not get a warm reception from one of the wealthiest Jews in Europe, Baron Maurice de Hirsch, when Herzl approached him in 1896 and said, can you help me? I'd like to basically buy through the Ottoman Turks. I would like to use the kind of money you could provide to get their permission to settle Jews in Palestine. And Hirsch said, no way. The fact is that Herzl did, with his audacity, he did manage to, on his own, without connections from wealthy Jews at all, he managed to meet some of the most important people in Europe at the time. I mean, he met with the Ottoman Sultan several times. He met with the British colonial and foreign secretaries. He met the German emperor. He met the king of Bulgaria, the king of Italy, and the Pope. Now, how was he able to do this? He was a journalist, but he wasn't just any journalist. He was at the most prestigious newspaper in Central Europe. He was its Paris correspondent, and then he was its literary editor, which was a hugely influential thing to be at that time. He could make or break the career of, basically any writer. He was a very powerful man. And any world leader wants a good journalist to give them a good interview. They all want good press. Herzl had cred. He had access. And he was able to meet these important people. At one point, the Kaiser invited him to Jerusalem and said, "I'm going to Jerusalem. Why don't you meet me there?" And here we see Herzl, and David Wolfson is there in the picture, and Max Bodenheimer, and a couple of others. And there they are in their evening dress. It is about 40 degrees Celsius. It's extremely hot. And they're in Jerusalem. It's actually not 40, probably about 36, but it's very hot. And they are going to see the Kaiser in his tent just outside of Damascus Gate in Jerusalem to meet the Kaiser. And the Kaiser eventually said, "No, what you want, I can't do it, because the Ottoman Emperor is not going to allow Jews to move to Palestine in large numbers." But again, just the chutzpah of Herzl to have been able to get these meetings in the first place is quite remarkable. Here we see Herzl in Palestine in proper colonial dress on a white donkey. And here we see a postcard that Herzl sent to his eldest daughter, Pauline, from Jerusalem. It's a postcard that has the Kaiser on it. Herzl was actually quite enamored of Wilhelm II. So Herzl attempted all of these diplomatic negotiations. What did they lead to? Well, for the most part, not much. I mean, the German Kaiser said no. All of his meetings with, pretty much every country except the United Kingdom went nowhere. But it is true that the United Kingdom extended him something that he thought was valuable. He had hoped they would give him rights to settle Jews in Cyprus or in the Sinai Peninsula. They said no, but we will offer you territory in what is today Kenya, along the Uganda Railway. And this became known as Uganda, although it wasn't Uganda, it was Kenya. And Herzl considered this to be a great honor, not because he was planning on settling millions of Jews in Eastern Africa. He never intended that. He intended this as a political gesture that the British government was recognizing the Zionists. He even wrote to Nordau, "This is our political Rishon LeZion." Rishon LeZion being one of the early Zionist settlements, agricultural moshavot from the first Aliyah. This is the beginning of something. Unfortunately, the Zionist movement didn't quite understand it that way. There were many Zionists, particularly from Eastern Europe, who were deeply offended at the very idea of Jewish settlement in East Africa. They thought it was an abandonment of Zionism, although Herzl protested that it wasn't. He recites, "Im yeshkachech Yerushalayim," if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its cunning, at the 6th Zionist Congress in 1903, but the damage is done. Herzl himself is even more weary from this battle. He died about 7-8 months after that. But this actually was a very important issue. And this gets us back to great leadership. That Herzl, like a lot of great leaders of his time who were trying to win independence for colonized regimes or independence for states that were for peoples who were stateless, you work with the international system. The Congress Party in India in 1885 worked with British politicians. Saad Zaghloul, here we see him up in the upper part of the picture, the founder of the Waft Party in Egypt, he also worked with the British government, to slowly gain independence for Egypt. Herzl was deeply aware that the Zionist movement was dependent on the international community. I just want to emphasize this, because we think of Herzl in terms of sovereignty for Jews, the Jews taking command over their own fate. That's true, but he knew that whatever political entity would take form in Palestine, and he had different ideas. It might be a sovereign state, It might be a province of the Ottoman Empire. That's what he talked about with the Sultan. It might be a protectorate under Germany or under Britain. No matter what, this Jewish community will be part of an international community. And that's why he helps formulate the Basel program of the ZO. Zionism seeks to secure for the Jewish people a publicly recognized, legally assured, öffentlich rechtlich, right, publicly homeland, Heimstätte in Palestine. Herzl's a man of the world. He doesn't want the Jews to be isolated in their own little confines. He envisions a world in which the Jewish state is admired by, or whatever takes form in Eretz Israel, is admired by people the world over. In his novel, Old New Land, he envisions trains going from Eretz Israel to Baghdad and Damascus and so forth. So to finish up, when is Herzl's vision then achieved? One could argue that it's at least partially achieved in 1917. Because what is the Balfour Declaration? But a declaration by the British government that it recognizes the Zionist program and that it will help promote a Jewish national home in Palestine. So one could argue that this is something that Herzl himself would have been very pleased with. Herzl would have been thrilled that not a year after the Balfour Declaration, a group of stateless peoples in Europe, Czechs, Slovaks, Yugoslavs, Ukrainians, Romanians, Greeks, and so forth, they were invited Zionists to an assembly in Philadelphia to call for independence for the stateless peoples of Europe. And there the Jews, the Zionists, are with this group of people all working together for a post-war order. And by the way, the Zionist representative here was none other than Itamar ben Avi, the son of Eliezer ben Yehuda, the founder of modern Hebrew. So I think that's a very nice touch. Herzl's legacy then, to finish. You know, you said that every faction in the Knesset paid homage to Herzl in the spirit of the 2004 Herzl Law. Herzl's legacy is very much that of the state of Israel. Here we see the ceremony in 1949 when his bones were disinterred from Vienna and buried in Eretz Israel. The fact is, though, that every generation has created its own Herzl and its own image of Herzl. So we see the larger-than-life figure from the late 19th century, the much sadder figure as he is presented some years after his death, the Herzl figure who is associated with the achievement of statehood in 1948, and then we see an image from 2017 where Herzl has been, you know, transformed into a hipster with an earring. And the fact is, in the state of Israel today, and I appreciate the spirit behind the Herzl Law, according to public opinion polls, about half of Israeli young people don't even know who he was, which is amazing when you think about it, given, you know, it makes you realize what young people pay attention to in school. As any of us who teach university find out pretty quickly, that a lot of people in Israel don't know. They think maybe he was a prime minister, maybe he was president. Different factions in Israel claim different aspects of his life. The Israeli left claims Herzl the utopian social reformer. The Zionist right claims Herzl the nationalist. And everybody reads into Herzl something that they want. I actually think Herzl was more complicated than any of these things. He was a deeply complicated man. He was a product of his time who accomplished greatness. And although I don't have time to show this, I'll be happy to send on, for anyone who's interested, the link, or you can just find this on YouTube. This is a silent film made about Herzl from the 1920s. It's a very short film that actually represents an image of Herzl that doesn't have a whole lot to do with historical reality, but it just shows you how much Jews the world over wanted a leader to venerate, to adore, to symbolize their hopes and their dreams. At the end of the day, there were many things to Herzl other than his charisma, but his charisma is, I'd say, that quality of Herzl, which remains the most enduring to this day. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to your questions. I'll stop my screen share. There we go. Okay.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Professor Penslar. I can tell you, as somebody who has spent many years of my own life researching and writing about Herzl, that it's always pleasant to be able to engage in a new kind of analysis of what are the personality traits that led to his success. I wanted to ask you, first of all, you talked about his projecting greatness. And again, I want to remind everybody, please share your questions in the Q&A and we'll be able to get to them. You talked about his projected greatness, and yet we learn and we know that he suffered from depression. And I just wonder, you highlighted some of the other leaders where that has gone hand in hand. I wonder, however, if that charisma is actually a part of not only a professional persona, but actually the common personal style, meaning in his life, in his family. Maybe it wasn't true, but how do you look at charisma when it comes to the common person, not the leader? Do you think it also plays a role in how a person's success is viable?
Tough question, because I've seen only in America, you get books like How to Be Charismatic. And I think charisma is just
Not really a taught thing.
no, I mean, some people just have it. I think it's a quality of character, but it is not at all unusual. It's not that all depressives are charismatics, but a lot of charismatics have depression. And there's even a book about this, it compares Lincoln, who suffered from depression, Lincoln, Churchill, Martin Luther King Jr., who suffered from depression, Mahatma Gandhi, the Mahatma. I think part of it is that they're always holding themselves up to a very high standard. They're ambitious and they hold themselves to a high standard, and then they're always going to feel like they're not fulfilling it. But what this one psychiatrist writes is that someone who has not too high, but if they have just a little bit of a level of depression, and maybe a little bit of the opposite, a little bit of kind of hyperthemia or ebullience, it makes them reach out to people. It makes them, they generate an internal energy that people find attractive. So the depression is what actually makes them accessible and reachable. You see your sorrow in their sorrow, but also their energy energizes you. I mean, I've been in the presence of charismatic figures in my own life, whether they be, I don't know, well, not university administrators, but whatever. It's a quality of kind of almost like an energy field. And I don't think that they wake up one morning and they say, I'm going to be charismatic. I think what happens is Herzl was aware that he had this capacity, and then you work with it. And he was aware of it. He even writes about it quite explicitly. And then the effect it has on people, because charisma is dialogic. So as I write in the book, if Herzl, for example, had been born in 1960 and had grown up in Shaker Heights, Ohio, he probably wouldn't have become a great political leader. Because we didn't need at that moment in the 1980s, 90s in the United States, there probably wasn't room for a charismatic political leader of his type. But in the 1890s in the Jewish world in Europe, they sure needed a charismatic leader like Herzl. So it's very much site specific and time specific. Herzl was the right man at the right time.
I think there is something important also to recognize. You mentioned the difference between his cultivated appearance versus what might have been sincere. I thought that was very poignant to point out, because I had in my analysis of Herzl have always interpreted it as true professional sincerity, meaning he wanted to accomplish a goal. I think that the charisma of Herzl allowed him to drive himself forward through all obstacles in order to achieve that goal. And maybe one of the things we suffer from, even in today's society, in Jewish community, is we may have people who can speak very well and they may have charisma, but is the goal clear? Or vice versa. Maybe there's someone with an ultimate goal, a wonderful, a lofty goal, but the charisma is lacking. What do you think would be the matching equivalent within a community? So charisma, if this is a necessary element of personality for a leader, what do you think is the matching element for a community to be able to accept a charismatic leader? You mentioned the decades where it wouldn't have been acceptable, but I also feel sometimes leaders aren't well received whether they're charismatic or not, in certain societal realities. So what do you see as the societal need in order to accept true leadership and charismatic leadership?
It's a tough question. I think there has to be an openness. I feel like we're in a political state right now where we are either extremists or cynics.
That's true.
And cynics by nature don't accept charismatic leadership. They're suspicious of charismatic leadership. And we should be suspicious of some charismatics because they are charismatic charlatans. They are charismatic people who are evil. I mean, some of the most evil people in the 20th century were charismatics. So we have to be careful. And then we have extremists who do gravitate to charismatic leaders. So what we have to do, and I don't quite know how to go about it, and I do it in a small way through my education, but of course I reach small numbers of students every year. I teach at a private university, and you don't reach scores of thousands of students. To impress upon them the need for a less cynical approach to what it means to be political. For example, I've been teaching for 35 years. I have not had a single student who has made a political career, and I've had brilliant students. I've taught at some of the best universities. I've had wonderful students. They are succeeding in every conceivable way except one. None of them went into politics. That's not true. I had one who went into politics and then left. So what's going on here? These are wonderful, talented, bright people. And they're doing so. I think this is the bigger issue. It's not the problem of leadership. It's a problem of why we as a society find politics to be so distasteful. And politics is very distasteful in the United States right now. I won't mention Israel, but we're going to have to work to make ourselves more accessible to, more interested in being involved in politics. And then we'll become more receptive to the right leaders when they come along.
It's interesting because I might have even taken that from a different direction, meaning we need to be able to accept leadership in order to shift the trends in politics. Maybe that is one of the reasons why Herzl was able to accomplish what many we of course call them Zionists, but the lovers of Zion, the Chovevei Zion movement. I know one of the questions that was asked by our participants, and we have a few have been asked. I want to be able to get to them in our shortened time. One of them is, how do you, in your research, how do you think that his relationship was with the lovers of Zion movements, the pre-political Zionistic supporters of Jewish nationalism and sovereignty and return to the land of Israel, and also how were they working together? How did it help him in his success? How did they receive his charisma in these small towns throughout Eastern Europe?
Well, it works a couple of different ways. And the fact is, as I mentioned, that the Chibat Zion leadership they viewed him with some suspicion, precisely because, well, he wasn't an Orthodox Jew. He wasn't raised in a traditional background. He actually knew more Yiddish than people give him credit for, but his Yiddish was passive at best. He knew very little Hebrew. He was an outsider, and he wasn't one of them. And there was a lot of distrust. Having said that, Herzl had quite an impact on the East European masses. We see this, or South European, when he was in Sofia, Bulgaria, or when he was in Vilna. The impact he had on the crowd was quite strong. But the Chovevei Zion leadership often viewed him with a deep suspicion and, like I said, jealousy. And they wrote about this again explicitly, or they were distrustful of him until they met him. A good example, actually, this is someone who wasn't that much of a Zionist. Nachum Sokolov was the editor of a Hebrew language newspaper at Sefirah in Warsaw. And he was suspicious of Herzl. And then he met Herzl and he was bowled over, just bowled over, and oh my God. So that gets back to your point about if you meet the charismatic leader, it can change everything. I'm just worried because of the potential of a charismatic to be the misleader, which Herzl wrote about. He wrote, "Be very worried about leaders who will mislead you." And he said, I know that I'm an honest person. I know that I'm a good person, but we have to be very wary of the charismatic who misleads. This is a theme that comes up in a lot of his literary writings, and we should be careful as well.
And interestingly enough, it relates to one of the questions that has been asked, which is whether or not one could analogize, the embrace of Herzl by Jews to those who had followed Jacob Frank or Shabtai Tzvi, some of the other false messiahs. And I think that you've already addressed that just in terms of, he himself was very wary of creating an insincere following. And he very much wanted that. I can tell you from my experience in Vilna, one of the last plaques, the only plaques that remains in the old town is the plaque that commemorates Herzl's visit.
Really?
And I had found many pieces of evidence that talked about, yes, their suspicion of him, but also their gratitude. And I think you see this also later on when Herzl is referred to in some of the Russian Jewish literature after the Balfour Declaration was announced in Sokolka, Russia, for example, where they celebrated and they recalled Herzl's leadership and they recalled his role, even though they, as the Chovevei Tzion, the Chibat Zion movement, they did have their divide ideologically and perhaps even jealously over what he was able to achieve.
Oh, look, after the fact, they realized how important he was. And I end the book with Martin Buber, who criticized Herzl quite harshly during Herzl's life. But then Herzl dies and Buber realizes what they've lost. And he writes very movingly about Herzl after his death.
Yeah, it's interesting. Herzl becomes somebody who has been openly criticized and openly embraced. Do you think that his type of leadership would be embraced today? Do you think that he would appreciate what is happening in Israel? Or do you think that he would make a shift in some leadership tendencies using his own talents?
It's a tough question, partly because Herzl lived in such a different era. He died in 1904, and the difference between 1904 and 2021 is enormous. I think it would be actually hard for him to take in what the world is. It's hard enough for me to understand the world in 2021. I think it would be very hard for him. Having said that, Herzl, there were two aspects to Herzl that I mentioned. One is the need for Jewish self-control, autonomy. The other is Israel in the world, or the Jews in the world. His whole vision was that a Jewish state would put an end to anti-Semitism because it would bring honor to the Jews, and the non-Jews would respect the Jews, and those Jews who moved to Eretz Israel would be happy in their own way, and those Jews who stay behind would be happy in their own way. So he would, of course, be very disappointed about the ongoing existence of anti-Semitism. He would have been, I think, just crushed had he known what would befall European Jewry during World War II. And I think he would be puzzled by the Arab-Israeli conflict and by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because for good or bad, he was a product of his time. He did not fully appreciate that the kind of national aspirations that he understood that Jews had and that Armenians had and lots of other Europeans had, he didn't really fully understand that people in the Middle East would have those aspirations as well. He did understand that for Egypt. He writes about it in his diary, about the young Egyptians who might wind up throwing the British out. He only went to Palestine once for 10 days, and he never really understood the country or people who lived in it. And he had correspondence with a former mayor of Jerusalem who was very polite and said to Herzl, your views are quite admirable in many ways, but this country does have a population of Arabs, and Herzl really didn't know how to deal with that. So I think Herzl would be, in some ways, he'd be, frustrated, very saddened by the state of Israel today. And I think he would also be saddened by the domestic political gridlock and the domestic political atmosphere. I don't want to get very political, so I'll be cautious with my words, but I just want to say that Herzl was an impeccably honest man. Herzl did not have a corrupt bone in his body. He refused to take any money, not even a free gift, nothing, as the head of the Zionist organization. He used his own money. He spent down his wife's dowry, which she could have done without, but for him, financial honesty was his bond. And I think he would not like certain aspects of contemporary Israel in that respect as well.
I think it's important also to consider, since he was a leader in within the diaspora, how would he feel about the situation around the world for the Jewish people as a whole? Some people have said that part of the reason why anti-Semitism is so easily spread today is because of the infighting amongst our own people that we have, not only between political elements, but also between social factions and geographical factions. We have an increasing divide, however we feel about the word, between different perspectives. What is now the Israeli and what is the diaspora Jew, proudly so. And this conflict, as you addressed, he dealt with a lot of the infighting. So I don't know if he'd be so surprised. Actually, I don't agree necessarily that he'd be so surprised about the situation in Israel, because he had witnessed just how difficult it is, this dream of that we call Jewish unity. One of the things that I do think that Herzl was very adamant about was not backing down on the issue of Jewish rights in the face of other matters, other issues. Do you agree that he would stand up today using that charisma on the basis of his original theories and continue to stand up for Jewish rights publicly, whether it be politically or in journalistic writing?
I think it's very important not to read 2021 into 1900. Really, really important. Remember that Herzl said in 1898, the Jews have never been a political power and they never will be again. Herzl said that even in a Jewish state, the old city of Jerusalem should be internationalized. He said that the whole purpose of the Jewish presence really in the Holy Land vis-a-vis the international community is to protect the holy places for the benefit of the world. He really sees, yes, of course he cares about Jewish safety, but he's always thinking in terms of how the Jews, and maybe he's wrong on this, okay? But he was thinking very much about how the Jews are going to need and how they're going to be protected by the international community. He is not envisioning a state with a powerful army. Remember that in Neuland, there's no army. There's no army in his vision of what the future Jewish homeland would be like. In that sense, you could say Herzl was wrong, which is fine. I mean, even a great leader doesn't have to get everything right.
True, except that he probably couldn't have envisioned the war, the imposition of wars that we've been forced to deal with. I think that is definitely, and I'm not in asking my question, it's not to try to interject the two generations together, but we're living at a time where people are looking for answers, and they're not. I'm very against creating historical parallels. There was even a question as to whether Hitler could be considered a charismatic leader, and I can just say flat out, I agree. Yes, he absolutely would be considered a charismatic leader, which makes him one part of the reason he was so successful for the German nation. However, what we need to think about as Jews, we are really suffering from a lack of cultivated leadership. We're looking at so much infighting that our own youth are so confused. Most of them are willing to go the route of the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist rhetoric and narratives, and even adopt those philosophies couched within Jewish identity, much because they are lacking an understanding of what does it mean to be a Jewish leader today. If you were to, as we end our time together shortly, what would you tell, what do you think Herzl would tell young Jewish leaders today, or even the elder Jewish leaders, about reaching and getting those young voices more active on Jewish nationalism and the matter of Israel and Jewish rights?
Well, I mean, my experiences, frankly, haven't been what you're talking about. I've taught at many different universities, and a lot of my students aren't Jewish, but to the extent I have Jewish students, I have found them to be committed, engaged, well-informed. Yes, they are often troubled by what's happening in Israel, and their political views might not be the same as their parents. That's true. But I have not found them to be espousing some kind of simplistic anti-Zionist rhetoric. I'm not saying such students don't exist, they do, but they don't wander into my classes, let's put it that way. And I have had, every now and then it doesn't go so well, but for the most part, I've found my students, I have huge respect for my students. And I think one thing that I always say to anyone who's concerned about the youth is, why don't you work with the people who teach the youth? Right? Work with the university professors and the high school teachers, because I actually spend my life, I've got the privilege of spending my life with the most talented and often the nicest young people. So I would actually, give them a little credit, would be the first thing.
give a ton of credit. I give a ton of credit to them. I just know also, unfortunately, the people who are at Harvard or other universities and colleges are not necessarily the people who are engaging in social media, where so much of the hate is being spread. I had moderated a discussion with a group on Herzl in a social media realm and what that would be like. And it was quite enlightening.
You get horrible stuff. No, I mean, like comments on my YouTube videos or whatever. Yeah, you get horrible stuff.
Yes, you do. And so I think that's the real crux of it is, what are we saying that this charisma, how do we transport it to the next generation? And I love that your students have it. Unfortunately, we do see so many people who are simply afraid to express themselves as Jews on campus or in their classes because of the rising rhetoric against Jews and Israel. And again, it's a whole big discussion we could get into, but
just then, I know we're finishing up, but Herzl was quite adamant about being honorable. There were two things that were essential to Herzl's persona. One was honor, and the other was authenticity. Be yourself, don't cover it up, don't hide, and be a person of honor. He had personal honor. And that might be something that young Jews, like any young person, regardless of what kind of identity, whatever it is they're trying to assert, ethnic, religious, national identity, gender identity, whatever it is, to be honorable and not to hide. However, at the same time, for Herzl, honor meant also not being aggressive. And it meant having the security, the self-assurance to deal with your adversaries and your opponents, as he would put it, with a stiff back and a placid face. In other words, that yes, I think young people they do face problems in university campuses, but to learn how to deal with that with the kind of grace that Herzl stood for. Herzl was a man of great, not just physical beauty, but a kind of grace in his bearing. And maybe honor is an outdated concept, but I think there's something to it. And honor can be much more than the kind of very male-centered way that Herzl, who was very much a product of his time, he didn't really think of women as having honor, for example. Well, we live in a different world. And men, women, again, regardless of who you are, what you are, whatever, self-worth, dignity, these things matter. And if you have that sense, you can deal with people who disagree with you, and you can deal with them in a way where you're actually going to get through to them rather than screaming at each other. So, and Herzl was a master of that, because remember, he was a diplomat, and he heard some pretty strange things from the people he was talking to when he did negotiations, and he knew how to talk to them. So I think that would be a concrete thing for young people to take from someone like Herzl, is the commitment to personal honor.
Absolutely. And I think a brilliant way to wrap up our discussion tonight. That is a phenomenal pitch for every organization of the American Zionist movement to bring back with them through your own leadership to the members of all ages and of all types and walks. And I think that the question of honor and dignity and sincerity, these are some beautiful lessons that we can pass on. Thank you so much, Professor Penslaw, for your time tonight. And may you continue to have great success in the classroom and, of course, in your writing. For those of you who are interested, please come and get your discount through AZM. And, of course, for any resources on Herzl, you're welcome to come to IsraelForever.org. So thank you all very much for joining us tonight. It has been a wonderful evening, and we wish you all a very meaningful Yom Herzl.
Thank you all. Thank you.